The veteran soldier of the mid-20th century was not a man easily shaken. By the time the dark clouds of World War II reached their climax, a German Lancer on the Eastern Front or a Japanese defender in the Pacific had witnessed the absolute nadir of human existence. They had survived the freezing, flesh-rotting mud of Rzhev. They had endured the bone-shattering, weeks-long artillery barges of the Somme in a previous generation or the relentless meat grinder of Stalingrad in this one. They had seen their comrades vaporized by heavy shells, starved on frozen rations, and driven mad by the sheer, unceasing terror of industrial warfare. They believed they knew what war was. They believed they had looked into the very eyes of death and conquered their fear. Yet, when these battle-hardened men finally came face to face with the reality of American war production, something inside them snapped. It was not a failure of courage. It was the sudden, crushing realization of a terrifying truth. They were not just fighting an army. They were fighting an automated, infinite machine that could not be stopped, could not be tired, and could not be reasoned with. It was the moment they realized the war had been lost before they even fired their first shot. To understand why this realization broke the spirit of the world's most disciplined soldiers, one must first understand the nature of militarism in Europe and Asia. For centuries, nations like Germany and Japan built their societies around the cult of the warrior. They believed that war was ultimately decided by the human spirit, by Geist, by Bushido, by willpower, discipline, and tactical brilliance. A soldier's duty was to endure, to outfight, and to outmaneuver the enemy. When the Axis powers looked at the United States in the late 1930s, they saw a decadent, soft, civilian-focused democracy. They saw a nation fractured by the Great Depression, with a standing army smaller than that of Portugal or Romania. They assumed that American soldiers, raised on consumerism and comfort, would crumble when confronted with the fanaticism of men forged in the fires of totalitarian discipline. What they failed to realize was that America's true weapon was not its small peacetime army, but its titanic, untouched industrial landscape. When that landscape was mobilized, it did not just produce weapons. It redefined the very physics of warfare. The shock of this transition first hit Axis veterans on the battlefields of North Africa, Normandy, and the Pacific, and it arrived not as a tactical defeat, but as an overwhelming sensory overload. German veterans of the Russian front, accustomed to highly precise but deeply strained supply lines, were horrified by the sheer, casual abundance of American logistics. In the German army, a broken-down tank or a truck with a shattered axle was a minor tragedy. It meant waiting weeks for a specialized spare part to be forged in Essen and shipped across a continent, or, more likely, abandoning the vehicle entirely. When German officers captured American supply depots in Tunisia or France, they expected to find the same desperate, hand-to-mouth rationing they practiced. Instead, they found crates of pristine, standardized spark plugs, pre-packaged engine blocks, and mountains of rubber tires, all perfectly interchangeable and ready to be bolted onto any vehicle by teenage mechanics who had learned to drive tractors in Iowa. But it was not just the spare parts that broke their spirits. It was the food, the comfort, and the casual disregard for scarcity. There is a famous, historically documented anecdote of a German officer captured during the Battle of the Bulge. While being held in a rear area tent, he was served a fresh dish of ice cream. When he asked where it had come from, he was told it had been manufactured in a mobile ice cream parlor unit and shipped to the front lines that morning alongside fresh, warm bread baked in automated field ovens. The officer, who had spent the last 3 years watching his men eat moldy rye bread and slaughter their own transport horses for survival in the snow, reportedly broke down in tears. It was a psychological shattering. He realized that while his country was starving its civilian population to forge a handful of Tiger tanks, the United States was so wealthy, so industrially dominant, that it could fight a total war on 2 oceans and still maintain a fleet of dedicated ice cream barges for its troops' morale. The sheer disparity in resource allocation made their own sacrifices feel utterly meaningless. In the Pacific, the Japanese soldier faced an even more terrifying manifestation of this industrial leviathan. The philosophy of Bushido dictated that spiritual purity and a willingness to die for the emperor would overcome any material disadvantage. But spirit cannot fight bulldozers. When the Japanese military spent months painstakingly carving airfields out of jungle rock using hand tools and forced labor, they believed they had secured a permanent strategic anchor. Then, the Americans would arrive. Within 48 hours of securing a beachhead, U.S. Navy Seabees would roll off landing craft driving massive, roar-snorting Caterpillar bulldozers, steamrollers, and automated asphalt spreaders. To the Japanese hiding in the jungle ridge lines, it looked like magic. Forests were leveled in afternoon sessions, swamps were drained and paved over by sunset. By the third day, a fully operational airfield, complete with metal plank runways, fuel pipelines, and electric searchlights, would be hosting waves of American bombers. The Japanese veterans, who had spent years training their bodies to survive on a cup of rice a day and sheer willpower, watched this mechanical terraforming with a mixture of awe and absolute despair. They realized they were fighting a force that could literally rewrite the geography of the Earth faster than they could dig a trench. This material asymmetry extended directly into the deadly mathematics of combat. In the air and on the sea, the scale of American production defied comprehension. Before the war, Japanese Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto warned his government that to defeat America, they would have to march all the way to Washington and dictate terms in the White House. Because if the American industrial giant was allowed to wake, it would drown Japan in steel. His warning was ignored, and his prophecy was fulfilled with terrifying precision. During the entire course of the war, Japan managed to build approximately 17 aircraft carriers of all types. In that same time frame, American shipyards launched over 140 aircraft carriers, including dozens of highly efficient escort carriers. To a Japanese pilot or naval officer, the math was devastating. They could execute a flawless tactical operation, sacrifice their best pilots to sink an American carrier, and celebrate a great victory, only to return to sea a month later and find 3 new American carriers standing in its place. It was a war against a hydra. Every time a beast's head was severed, the American assembly lines grew 3 more. On the ground in Europe, this mechanical supremacy took the form of what the Germans called Materialschlacht, the war of materials. In the German army, artillery was a precious, highly coordinated tool. Shells were rationed, and gun crews were trained to make every shot count. When they encountered the U.S. Army, they encountered time-on-target artillery. American industrial output was so massive that artillery units did not calculate shell consumption in rounds. They calculated it in tons. If an American patrol took a single sniper shot from a village, they did not send an infantry to clear the buildings at the cost of American lives. Instead, they picked up a field telephone and called in a barrage. Within minutes, dozens of batteries of 105 mm and 155 mm howitzers, backed by an endless supply of ammunition arriving on fleets of Red Ball Express trucks, would rain thousands of high-explosive shells onto the target. The village would simply cease to exist. German veterans, who prided themselves on their superior tactical maneuvers and infantry doctrine, found themselves utterly neutralized. They realized that their military genius did not matter because the Americans would simply substitute steel for blood. This realization stripped away the romanticism of war and exposed the cold, hard gears of the machine age. For a battle-hardened veteran, the most frustrating and spirit-breaking aspect of fighting the Americans was that the Americans did not seem to be playing by the rules of heroic struggle. They did not seek the glory of hand-to-hand combat. They did not celebrate the beauty of a tragic, honorable death. The Americans fought like factory foremen, treating the battlefield like an assembly line where the raw material was the enemy, and the finished product was a cleared objective. They brought cranes to lift tanks, prefabricated bridges to cross rivers, and endless streams of standardized trucks that ran on high-octane fuel that the Axis could only dream of. When the war ended and Axis prisoners of war were shipped back to the United States, the final, crushing blow to their psyches was delivered not by barbed wire, but by the American home front. As German and Japanese prisoners looked out the windows of their transport trains, they did not see a war-weary, ruined nation. They saw cities gleaming with electricity, highways packed with civilian automobiles, and grocery store shelves overflowing with meat, fruit, and consumer goods. They saw factories working triple shifts under bright lights, not out of desperate survival, but out of a calm, hyper-efficient routine. They realized that while their own families had been eating sawdust bread and dodging Allied bombs in ruined cellars, the civilian population of America had barely felt the material pinch of the greatest conflict in human history. This was the ultimate psychological breaking point. The veteran soldiers realized that their years of suffering, their lost limbs, their dead brothers in arms, and their fanatical devotion to their nations had been spent in service of a mathematical impossibility. They had been sent to fight an empire of assembly lines with nothing but flesh, bone, and spirit. And as they looked at the endless, smoking chimneys of the American Rust Belt, they finally understood that the machine had won, and their world of martial glory had been crushed beneath the weight of an unstoppable industrial avalanche.